Welcome to part 4 of my talk about async in .NET. In this one I'm going to particularly cover deadlocks in ASP.NET, the old version, not ASP.NET Core. The principles apply to desktop apps, Windows Phone apps, but I haven't covered that here specifically, so you'd have to translate that. If you're working in ASP.NET Core or just do console apps, you don't have to worry about any of this and you can skip this video. So this controller code, this will always deadlock. A deadlock basically means that you call this action method here, this controller method here, and it will never return, and it will just sit and block on this call here that never returns. The issue is this, that this code here, this do something method that you're calling here, doesn't await, and then there's a callback at this point. Remember, your compiler rewrites this code into making this a callback. That thing will want to do a lock on the request, on the synchronization context, which is basically the request context. However, you call .wait here, and .wait and .result, they're the same thing. They block the current thread until the task completes. But that is then locking the synchronization context. So this is locking the request context, I should say, which is a synchronization context for this async code. So the request state, if you like, simplifying it slightly, is locked by this wait statement here, and this callback here can't run because in ASP.NET, the old version, it requires that lock to avoid multiple callbacks running in parallel, and that's to avoid your code being multi-threaded when you wouldn't expect it to be. So this will always deadlock. This one here will never deadlock, because what you're doing is you are blocking in the same way, but you have specified configure await false. When you do that on an await like this, what you're basically saying to the system is, look, this task here, the callback that you're going to rewrite for me here, I don't want you to lock on the synchronization context, so you can just run that on whatever thread you like, and I'm happy with that. I'm aware that there's multi-threading going on and I don't care. So this will run just fine, it will never deadlock, which is why they generally say the way to eliminate deadlocks in ASP.NET is to use configure await false everywhere. It does introduce threading issues, but you might as well get used to it because it's the default in ASP.NET Core. Now, the two previous ones were relatively straightforward. It's much more fun when you get things that sometimes deadlock. So here's an example for you. In this scenario, we have two callbacks. So we call this method here to get a task. We then do something else asynchronously. In this case, wait 5 seconds, and then this code here. That's the callback that runs after this is finished. And in this case, we are then blocking on the first time. Now, this is obviously very, very stupid code because you're mixing blocking behavior with async await behavior. But you know, sometimes you see this kind of stuff, and it's just to illustrate a point. So what will happen is if we run through this and our call to Google takes less than 5 seconds. So what will happen is we create the task, we start talking to Google. Less than 5 seconds later, we come back and try and run this callback code. We try and get a lock on the request context, and it's fine because this code here is still away waiting for this thing asynchronously, so this isn't blocking the request context either. However, when this code comes back, this will then block on the request context, and it will block the thread waiting for this to run, or to finish, sorry. So we're now blocking the request context here, and then when the call to Google that took 6 seconds returns, this can't run and we will deadlock. So this is the kind of timing issues you get where sometimes you deadlock, sometimes you don't. And that's where you really get the real pain, because you're running it on your machine and it's all fine, and then sometimes in production it just doesn't respond, there's no errors in your logs, and you know it can be a real head scratcher. And this kind of code can cause that kind of thing. Another example is this. So in this case, I'm passing in a parameter called doltFast. It's again just so you can test it. This is in the code examples online. But what's going to happen here? So we're going to call or do something, and it says, okay, if we're going to do it fast, it might be that I have something in cache, for example. I'm just going to return an await on that task from result, and then that means I'm So task.fromResult returns a task that is already completed. And that's quite important, because if the task is already completed, the compiler will actually not do a lock on the request context. It will not try and run anything on another thread. It will just return on the same thread. So this code will run just fine, because we're getting a task that's already completed. There's no actual async stuff going on. The state machine is there, but it doesn't do any of the locking stuff. It just returns up to here and Bob's your uncle. However, if we go down the other code path, we are now going to actually do something proper asynchronous. There is actually a hidden callback here that can't run, because this is blocking on our .result there, and then that code will deadlock. You combine that with the timing issue from the previous ones, and you can see sometimes you just get code that doesn't do what you expect it to do in production some of the time, and some of the time it's fine. So the key thing to avoiding deadlocks, again, ASP.NET Old and so on, is firstly, really try really hard not to use .wait and .result. Okay, there are some special cases where you really can't avoid it, but then there are other ways you can handle it by doing things on task.run and so on, but try not to do it. Try and use configure await explicitly everywhere. Sometimes you want to put false, sometimes you want to put true, like in UI apps, but there's a plugins for Visual Studio ReSharper you can use, and they will remind you to always put them on, and then at least it forces you to think about it. So that's the top tip for today.